The mountain is not dark. It is gray. A heavy, motionless gray that does not change when the sun goes down behind the granite ridge. The mist up here does not drift. It settles into the crevices of the stone like damp wool, thick enough to muffle the sound of the wind, but thin enough to let the cold through. The cold is a flat, dry weight. It does not make the skin shiver. It enters the bone directly through the fingertips, slowing the pulse in the wrist until your hands feel heavy, like wet pine. Swicht Station 42 sits in the middle of this gray. It is a square structure, exactly 7 feet wide, exactly 7 feet long. The exterior is covered in corrugated tin plates that have turned a dark, graphite color from decades of mountain rain. The interior is lined with narrow pine boards. The boards were painted 3 times. The first layer was red. The second layer was charcoal gray. The current layer is a dull, institutional green that has started to blister and peel away from the baseboards in thin, brittle curls. The curls look like dead insects resting on the floor. There is no distance here. There is only the room. In the center of the 7-foot space sits a single plastic chair. It is gray. The left armrest is split along the factory seam, exposing a thin ridge of sharp, white plastic underneath. Every time I shift my weight, the split material pinches the fabric of my flannel shirt with a small, dry snap. It is the only rhythmic sound in the cabin. The clock on the wall does not tick. It is an old industrial relay box. Every 60 seconds, the internal brass will drop a tooth. Click. The sound does not travel through the air. It stays inside the wood of the desk. It travels up through the legs of the table into my palms and stops at the elbow. I am the night shift operator. My name is written on a piece of white cardstock taped to the iron clipboard by the door. Mark. The letters were traced with a thin, technical pen that left tiny, bleeding gaps in the ink. There are no other names on the sheet. Vance, the day shift employee, did not wait for my arrival. He left at 5:50 p.m. His departure was silent. His old truck did not rev. It simply rolled backward down the gravel incline until the red taillights were swallowed by the blue mist at the base of the gorge. He did not leave a report. He left a blue plastic binder. The binder rests on the far corner of the scarred desk, exactly 2 inches from the edge of a white ceramic mug. The coffee inside the mug has been cold for 4 hours. A perfectly circular, translucent film has formed across the top of the black liquid. It looks like wet skin. When the green light from the desk lamp strikes the film, it reflects a faint, oily rainbow that does not move. The liquid is dead. At 12:08 a.m., the green track signal outside the window lost half its intensity. The light did not flicker. The electrical current simply dropped, narrowing the green beam until it looked like a thin, colored needle piercing the fog across the parallel rails. In that narrow beam of light, the mist did not look like water vapor. It looked solid. It looked like millions of tiny, microscopic grains of gray salt suspended in the air, perfectly still. They were not falling. They were not rising. They were waiting for the temperature to change. I reached out and pulled the blue binder toward the center of the desk. The plastic was cold. The corners were split, showing the gray, compressed cardboard structure beneath the synthetic skin. On the first page, there were no columns for train numbers or cargo weights. There were no signatures from the district supervisors. There was only a single sheet of standard typewriter paper glued to the inner lining with thick, yellow adhesive. The text was printed in all capital letters. The ink was a dark, charcoal graphite that had begun to smudge where fingers had pressed against the margins over the years. It was titled, station maintenance, and occupancy conditions. The room contains 4 distinct corners. If, while sitting in the plastic chair, you count a 5th angle in the paintwork, do not close your eyes. Select the blistering green gloss directly in front of you. Observe the shape of the peeling material until the angle squares itself again. This correction requires approximately 11 minutes of unbroken focus. I stopped reading. My fingers remained flat against the page. The air in the room grew heavy. It was not a sudden change. It was a gradual thickening of the atmosphere, as if the oxygen was being slowly replaced by something dense and cold. It smelled like wet zinc. It smelled like old iron nails that had been dissolved in stagnant well water. In the center of the floorboards, the manual switch lever rose 3 feet from a rectangular slot in the wood. It was a solid iron pillar, painted black, though the coating had been worn away at the grip, leaving the bare metal exposed. The metal was dull. It did not reflect the light from the cracked green shade of the lamp. It looked greasy, but when I touched it with the tip of my index finger, it was completely dry and freezing. Below the cabin, the thick steel guide cables ran down through the ballast into the earth. Through the leather soles of my boots, I could feel the mountain. The granite was not still. It vibrated with an incredibly low mechanical hum, the frequency of an old generator buried deep beneath the root systems of the pines. The clock dropped another tooth.
12:44 a.m.
The radio unit on the shelf gave a single, flat pop. It was a dry sound, like a dead twig snapping under a heavy heel in winter. The red indicator light on the face of the steel box did not turn on. The background static did not begin. The silence remained absolute, but the gray paper speaker cone behind the metal mesh was vibrating. It was moving back and forth with a rapid, frantic friction. Slide, slide, slide. It sounded like someone was dragging a heavy length of wet canvas across a coarse gravel path. The sound was distant, but every time the friction repeated, the green lamp on the desk lost a fraction of its illumination. The darkness in the corners of the room was expanding, sliding outward from the seams of the walls like dark grease. I looked down at the second page of the blue binder. It was completely blank. But as I watched, a small, dark spot appeared in the exact center of the white sheet. It was moisture. A single drop of dark water had fallen from the ceiling boards directly onto the text. I did not look up at the ceiling. I knew the roof was uninsulated tin. I knew there was nothing above the pine planks but the empty sky and the gray mist. The drop of water did not spread into the fiber of the paper. It stayed in a perfect, solid bead, reflecting the broken green light of the bulb like a glass eye. Underneath the typed text on the first page, a third rule had been written by hand using a very faint lead pencil. The graphite was so light that it was only visible when the lamp tilted at a specific angle. If the radio speaks using your own vocal cadence, do not correct its syntax. It uses the old structures, the structures from before the line was built. If you correct its grammar, it will understand that you are listening to the meaning of the words, not the weight of the air. The speaker cone stopped moving. The friction sound died. Then, a voice came through the mesh. It was thin, dried out by wires and distance, but it possessed the exact same flat, monotonous delivery that I use when I am exhausted. The same slight draw on the double letters. The same low, unhurried pitch. The water in the cistern is gray. My voice said from the metal box. I sat completely still. The blister was shaped like a blunt shoe, a heavy leather boot. The water in the cistern is gray. The radio repeated exactly 60 seconds later. Outside, the gravel path began to make a sound. Crunch. It was the sound of a single stone shifting against another stone. It happened at 1:12 a.m. Then nothing for 3 minutes. Then another crunch closer to the lowest wooden step of the cabin porch. The thing walking on the path was not rushing. It was moving with the exact same pacing as the clock mechanism on the wall. One heavy, deliberate compression of the wet earth for every tooth the brass will dropped inside the wood. I did not turn my head toward the double-paned window. My eyes did not leave the shoe-shaped blister. The room felt smaller now. The 4 green walls were no longer 7 feet apart. They were drawing inward, millimeter by millimeter, squeezing the cold air toward the center of the space until my lungs felt tight. The taste of old copper grew stronger on the back of my tongue. It felt like holding a rusted key in your mouth until the saliva turned sour. The voice on the radio spoke again. It did not repeat the phrase about the water. "Mark," it said. "My name." The tone was flat. "The switch is down. The line is clear. You can pack the canvas bag now. The dispatcher is standing at the gate. He has the blue key." I did not move. I did not blink. The blue key did not exist. The instructions in the binder explicitly stated that the handoff key was made of raw brass. It was 6 inches long. It had no color. The radio speaker began to emit a high, piercing hum. A frequency so thin and sharp that the cracked glass shade of the lamp began to ring with a tiny, metallic vibration. It felt like a long needle being forced slowly into the ear canal, pressing against the drum. Outside, the steps had reached the top of the porch. 3 stairs total. The wood was untreated pine, soaked by 40 years of mountain sleet. When weight was applied to it, it did not creak. Aside, a long, wet, hollow expiration that came through the gaps in the floorboards directly beneath my gray chair. The brass door handle did not rattle, but the green paint on the frame began to flake off, falling to the floor in small, dry sheets that made no sound as they hit the wood. The door handle remained horizontal. It did not move. It did not vibrate. But the wood around the brass plate grew dark, a faint circle of dampness spreading outward through the green paint like grease on brown paper. The smell of wet zinc became thick, cold enough to settle on the skin of my forehead in a thin, greasy film. The clock dropped a tooth. 1:45 a.m. The sound on the porch did not repeat. The wet sighing of the pine planks stopped, leaving the silence outside completely flat. The mountain wind had not returned. The blue mist stayed pressed against the double-paned window, its gray salt grains perfectly still in the narrow beam of the green track signal. I did not move from the gray plastic chair. My palms remained flat against my thighs, the fabric of my trousers freezing against my skin. At 2:02 a.m., the radio speaker gave 2 flat clicks. The voice did not speak. Instead, a rhythmic transmission began. It was not static. It was the sound of a mechanical typewriter operating over an open channel. Clack, clack, tap. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, unhurried. Every time the typewriter key struck the invisible ribbon, the needle on the desk lamp's bulb would jump, a tiny orange spark cracking inside the glass shade. I looked down at the blue binder. The dark drop of water in the center of the blank sheet had frozen. It was no longer a fluid bead. It was a small, black dome of solid ice, its surface textured with fine, concentric ridges that looked like a human fingerprint. I turned the page. The third sheet was not white. It was graph paper, blue lines forming exact, quarter-inch squares across the entire surface. In the upper margin, the printed text resumed. The letters were smaller now, the ink a dry, powdered charcoal that looked like it had been scraped from the inside of an exhaust pipe. The line does not accommodate private freight after midnight. All movements between the hours of 12 a.m. and 5 a.m. are unscheduled. Responsibility for the switch lever remains with the occupant of the chair. The position of the tracks must not be verified with the eyes. Rule number 4. The 3:14 arrival will not engage the compression brakes. It uses the vacuum line. If you hear the steam pressurizing beneath the floorboards, grip the base of the black iron column with both hands. Do not apply force. The lever will separate itself from the cast iron frame if the density of the air drops below the level of the mist. The typewriter sound on the radio stopped. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the weight of 20 miles of solid granite pressing down on the roof of Switch Station 42. My jaw felt stiff, the muscles behind my ears locking until my teeth clicked together with a small, dry sound. The clock dropped a tooth. 2:14 a.m. Exactly 1 hour remained before the dislocation. The green track signal outside the window did not turn off. It changed color. The green needle of light shifted into a dull, opaque crimson, the color of dried liver underwater. The red beam did not pierce the mist. It absorbed it, turning the gray salt grains across the gravel path into a solid wall of dark, glowing dust. I looked at the black iron lever in the center of the floorboards. The bare steel handle was sweating. Small, clear drops of moisture were forming along the metal grip, sliding down the column into the rectangular slot in the pine wood. The water was not clean. It was dark, carrying tiny flakes of old carbon grease that had been trapped inside the gear housing since 1974. The hum beneath my boots began to change pitch. The low, mechanical vibration of the mountain dropped by 2 octaves, becoming a heavy, rhythmic thudding that sounded like an engine running underwater. Thump, thump, thump. The interval was exactly 4 seconds. Between each vibration, the floorboards under my plastic chair would rise a single millimeter, then settle back into the joists with a dry creak. At 2:40 a.m., the temperature inside the 7-foot room began to fall. The decrease was not linear. It happened in flat, sudden drops. Every 3 minutes, the air would lose 5 degrees of heat, the change so sharp that I could feel the moisture on my eyelashes turning into fine, stiff crystals of salt. My breath no longer hung in a white cloud. It drifted downward in heavy, gray plumes that sank into the floorboards like smoke from wet birchwood. I did not reach for the dry wood beside the iron stove. My hands stayed on my thighs. The stove was cold. The iron chimney pipe leading through the ceiling tiles was choked with old soot, the metal dull and flaking with red rust. The logbook had been clear. The smoke from the chimney attracts the things that move along the high-voltage lines. The clock clicked. 3 a.m. The thudding beneath the floorboards stopped. The silence that returned was different. It was an active silence, the kind of stillness that exists inside an empty shell before the valve snaps shut. The air inside the cabin grew so thin that the white ceramic coffee mug on the desk began to crack, a long vertical split opening down the side with a sharp, clean sound like a dry twig breaking. The cold liquid did not leak. The skin film across the top stayed intact, holding the black coffee inside the broken ceramic like a solid mass. The radio unit gave a long, mechanical shriek. It was a high, constant whine that did not fluctuate in volume. The red dial light on the steel box flared once, its intensity so bright that it threw the shadow of the small desk lamp across the opposite wall. magnifying the shoe-shaped paint blister until it covered the entire green corner. Then the sound of the train began. It did not come from the northern pass. It did not come from the tracks down the gorge. It came from the gravel path outside my window, less than 4 feet from the glass. There was no whistle. There was no clatter of iron wheels against the parallel steel rails. There was only the sound of a massive, unlubricated weight moving through an empty space. A dry, grinding friction that made the corrugated tin plates on the exterior of the cabin rattle in their screw holes. The cabin began to tilt. The movement was slow, the northern wall rising 6 inches until the blue binder began to slide across the scarred wood of the desk. It drifted 2 inches, its plastic skin leaving a thin, wet trail on the timber, then stopped against the base of the cracked lamp. The 314 had arrived. It was 22 minutes early. Through the crimson window pane, I did not see an engine. I did not see oil-stained metal or timber flat cars. I saw the mist. The fog had turned entirely black, a dense, swirling column of carbon soot that was pressing against the outside of the glass like wet wool. The salt grains were gone. In their place were millions of thin, flat scales of dry, gray matter. They looked like skin flakes. They were falling from the sky in heavy, silent drifts, settling on the gravel path until the earth looked gray and white. The radio speaker spoke. The voice was no longer thin. It was wide, filling the 7-foot room until the timber walls began to vibrate with the frequency. "The loop is open," my voice said from the wire mesh. "The 314 has no passengers. It has no cargo. It has only the weight." I reached out with both hands. My fingers were stiff, the skin at the knuckles a dark, bruised blue from the cold. I gripped the cold steel handle of the black iron lever. The metal did not feel solid. It felt soft, like old tallow grease that had been left in a dark cellar for 40 years. As my palms tightened around the grip, the iron column began to separate itself from the floorboards, the heavy bolts at the base lifting out of the pine wood with a silent, effortless motion. The lever was floating. It was suspended in the center of the 7-foot space, held only by the density of the frozen gray air. Outside, the grinding sound stopped. The black mist against the glass froze, its surface turning into a flat, solid sheet of dark ice that completely blocked the crimson light of the track signal. The room became dark, not a normal dark, a heavy graphite black that left the shape of the green lamp visible only as a faint, blurred smear in the center of the desk. The clock did not click. The brass wheel inside the relay box had stopped between the teeth, the black second hand on the face freezing exactly 3 millimeters before the 12. The cabin did not return to its level position. It remained tilted at an angle of 6 inches, the northern wall slightly higher than the southern baseboards. The blue binder stayed pressed against the cracked base of the green desk lamp. The frozen bead of dark water on the third sheet of graph paper remained solid, its fingerprint-like ridges perfectly clear in the dim, graphite blackness of the room. The clock remained dead. The second hand was frozen 3 millimeters before the 12. At 3:32 a.m., the black ice on the outside of the window panes began to dissolve. It did not melt into liquid water. It evaporated directly into a dry, yellow gas that slid down the glass surface in thick, heavy streaks. The yellow vapor smelled like burnt zinc. It smelled like old dry cell batteries that had been left to rot inside an iron toolbox. Through the cleared glass, the track outside was visible again. The crimson light of the signal lantern had died completely. The parallel steel rails were no longer black. They were glowing with a faint, bioluminescent gray that did not illuminate the surrounding gravel path. In that cold light, the drifts of skin flakes across the ground looked 4 inches deep. They were completely dry, not moving even though the air outside was perfectly still. I sat in the gray plastic chair. My knees were locked, my boots pressing firmly against the pine planks to prevent my body from sliding toward the lower southern corner. The manual switch lever was still suspended in the center of the space. It did not fall back into the rectangular slot. It hung precisely 2 inches above the wood, the bare steel column dry, cold, and dark. The steel guide cables beneath the floorboards had stopped vibrating. The low, mechanical hum of the granite mountain was gone, replaced by a flat, dead void that made the interior of my skull ache. At 3:50 a.m., the condensation inside the 7-foot room began to change its structure. Moisture did not form on the window panes. It formed directly on the green-painted walls. Small, clear droplets emerged from the seams of the pine planks, rising through the blisters of the institutional green paint like sweat through skin. The water was thick. It did not slide down toward the baseboards. It stayed in place, growing larger until every surface in the room looked wet. I did not wipe the sweat from my forehead. My hands remained flat against my thighs. The moisture on my own skin was the same density as the water on the walls. Carried the faint flavor of old copper grease. The radio unit on the shelf gave 3 flat, dry clicks. The speaker cone did not move this time. The gray paper mesh remained rigid, but the metal casing of the machine began to hum. It was a very low frequency, a sound that was felt in the marrow of the teeth rather than heard by the ear. A voice came through the hum. It was not my voice. It was the voice of Miller. Miller was the dispatcher from the Valley Junction house who had died during the winter freeze of 1982. His voice was well known to the railroad operators. It was heavy, gravelly, and dragged on the consonants like a worn leather belt inside an engine. "The line is clear at the pass," Mark, Miller's voice said. The transmission was flat, devoid of any radio static or wire crackle. "The 314 has entered the loop. It is currently running along the northern siding. You must report the clearance to the central desk. Pull the manual key from the binder." I did not reach for the blue binder. My fingers did not twitch. The instructions on the typewriter sheet had been absolute. "The line does not accommodate private freight after midnight." Miller had been dead for 4 years. The central desk had been abandoned when the automatic relay system was installed at the lower junction. The radio hummed for exactly 60 seconds. Then the voice repeated the directive. "The line is clear at the pass, Mark. Pull the manual key." I kept my eyes fixed on the shoe-shaped blister in the green paint. The droplet of thick water that had formed in the center of that blister had grown to the size of a human eye. It was perfectly round, reflecting the faint gray glow from the parallel rails outside the window. Inside that droplet, the reflection was not showing the interior of Switch Station 42. It was showing the exterior. It showed the gravel path. It showed the dense pine trees. And it showed something else. A tall, narrow shape standing exactly 2 feet from the wooden stairs, its body perfectly still in the white skin flakes. The shape had no face. It wore a dark, Sarkari coat that was completely dry, the buttons made of tarnished brass that did not reflect the gray glow of the rails. The clock gave a sudden, sharp ping. The brass wheel inside the relay box dropped 3 teeth simultaneously. The black second hand snapped forward, stopping exactly on the 12. It was 4 a.m. The air inside the 7-foot room grew so dense that my ears popped twice. A sharp, clean sound like air escaping a sealed jar. The green glass shade of the desk lamp cracked further, a second spiderweb fracture creeping horizontally across the surface until the glass looked like a shattered mirror. The bulb inside did not turn off, but the light it emitted became narrow. A single, thin green line that struck the center of the frozen water bead on the logbook. Outside, the door handle made a sound. It was not a rattle. It was a slow, deliberate movement. The old brass knob turned 90 degrees clockwise, the internal spring mechanism groaning with a dry, metallic groan that came through the wood. The latch cleared the frame. The heavy wooden door did not swing inward. The deadbolt was still engaged, the thick iron bar holding the top of the pine planks firmly inside the steel bracket. But the wood at the center of the door began to bow. It curved inward toward the gray plastic chair, the green paint along the grains splintering into thousands of tiny, microscopic needles that floated into the cold air like dust. The shape outside was pressing its weight against the center of the planks, its force steady, mechanical, and silent. The voice on the radio started again. It was no longer Miller's voice. It was the voice of my brother. He was living 300 miles away in the city. He worked at an iron foundry near the docks. His voice was light, fast, and always carried a slight whistle through his front teeth. "Mark, hey, pick up the handset, man," the radio said. The delivery was completely flat, missing the natural urgency of his voice. "I'm at the crossing down by the creek. The bridge is washed out, Mark. The water is gray. It's rising up to the doors of the car. Come down and help me clear the timber from the culvert." I did not move my tongue. I did not take a breath. My brother had been buried in the churchyard at the mouth of the valley 3 years ago. The foundry had closed in the spring. The typewriter sound returned to the radio channel. Clack, clack, tap. Every strike of the invisible key aligned with the bowing of the wooden door. For every clack, the center of the pine planks pushed 1 millimeter further into the 7-foot space. The iron hinges at the top and bottom of the frame were starting to bend, the steel screws slowly drawing out of the dry pine timber with a faint, high-pitched screech. I looked down at the graph paper. The frozen drop of water had begun to cloud over. The black ice was turning into an opaque, chalky white, as if a fine salt was crystallizing inside the dome. Underneath the ice, the blue lines of the graph paper were fading, disappearing into the white fiber until the sheet was entirely blank. The voice of my brother spoke one final time. The date of the funeral was October 14th, the radio said. It was answering a question I had not asked. The ground was cold, Mark. Not ice cold, empty cold. You forgot to bring the blue key. The bowing of the door stopped. The heavy iron deadbolt did not snap. The wood stayed curved inward, a permanent, warped distortion in the center of the room that left a 3-inch gap at the top of the frame. Through that gap, the gray mist did not enter. Something else did. A single, thin stream of white skin flakes began to drift into the 7-foot room, falling silently onto the gray plastic chair, settling on the fabric of my sleeve like cold, waxy ash. The white skin flakes did not melt on the flannel of my sleeve. They stayed flat. They looked like small scales of dried tallow or parchment. When I looked closely at the fabric of my shirt, the material beneath the flakes had turned a dull, slate gray, the red and black pattern of the wool fading out as if the color was being extracted by the contact. The clock remained at 4 a.m. The black second hand did not quiver. At 4:12 a.m., the high, piercing frequency from the radio unit died. The metal casing stopped humming, But the gray paper speaker cone did not return to its neutral position. It remained sucked inward, drawn toward the back of the magnet structure until the paper looked like a deep, funnel-shaped hole in the front of the steel box. The voice that emerged next did not use the channel. It did not use the speaker. It came from the 3-inch gap at the top of the warped wooden door. "The shift is 74% complete," a female voice said. The delivery was completely clinical. It was the tone of an automated telephone time announcement from the 1970s. "The operator will verify the placement of the blue logbook. The blue logbook must not be closed while the air inside the cabin is yellow." I did not move my neck. I kept my eyes on the eye-shaped droplet in the green paint blister. The tall, narrow shape outside the door had moved. It was no longer standing in the white flakes by the wooden steps. It was standing on the top porch plank, its chest pressed directly against the outside of the bowed pine wood. I could see the reflection of its brass buttons through the droplet. They were not moving. They were perfectly aligned with the split in the frame. The radio box gave a long, mechanical rattle. It sounded like a handful of small iron washers being shaken inside a tin can. Rattle, rattle, clink. Every time the metal rattled, the white ceramic mug on the desk shifted 1 millimeter to the left. It was moving toward the edge of the table. The dark, frozen skin film across the top of the black coffee stayed rigid, but a thin, gray dust was beginning to rise from the vertical crack in the ceramic wall, settling on the timber like ash. I turned the page of the blue binder. My fingers felt like thick cardboard. The fourth sheet was not graph paper. It was a photographic plate, a black and white image printed directly onto thick, heavy fiber paper that smelled like vinegar and old silver nitrate. The photograph showed the interior of Switch Station 42. It showed the small desk. It showed the green lamp. It showed the manual iron lever rising from the floorboards. In the gray plastic chair, an operator was sitting. The back of his head was toward the lens. He wore a flannel shirt. His hands were flat against his thighs. On the left armrest of the plastic chair, the split in the factory seam was visible. It was small. It was less than an inch long. I looked down at the actual armrest beneath my left elbow. The split was no longer small. It had grown to 4 inches, the sharp white edges of the plastic gaping open like a dry mouth, showing the dark yellow foam lining inside. The foam was not dry. It was wet with a thick, clear fluid that smelled like sour zinc. The typewriter sound on the radio restarted. Clack, clack, tap. The speed was faster now. It was the rhythm of a legal stenographer recording a fast testimony. A new voice came from the gap in the doorframe. It was the voice of Vance, the day shift employee who had left at 5:50 p.m. The truck did not reach the base of the ridge, Mark, Vance's voice said. The tone was completely flat, stripped of his usual low-country drawl. The transmission failed at the 3rd culvert. The water was already gray. It was standing 3 feet deep over the road surface. I had to leave the keys in the ignition lock. Mark, the rules require the ignition to remain open if the operator is still on the mountain. I did not answer. I did not shift my weight in the chair. The logbook instructions on the first page had been clear. Vance did not leave a report. Vance had been gone for 6 hours. The voice outside the door continued, its pitch rising slightly with every sentence, though the delivery remained dead and mechanical. The relief operator will not arrive at 5, Vance said. The Union House does not have a record of Switch Station 42. The line was removed from the district maps in October of 1982. The station is an unmapped coordinate mark. The error up here is just a correction in the ledger. The photograph on the 4th page of the binder began to change. The black and white image did not fade. The ink simply shifted across the fiber paper, the silver grains migrating toward the center of the print. The figure in the gray plastic chair was no longer looking away from the camera. The head had rotated 90 degrees to the left. The profile of the face was now visible. It had no nose. It had no lips. The skin across the cheekbone was perfectly smooth, white, and marked with 3 thin, horizontal lines of black print text that read, "Property of Northern Pacific." The clock gave a single, violent shudder. The brass wheel inside the housing dropped 12 teeth at once, the metallic clang echoing through the 7-foot room like a hammer striking an empty rail. The black second hand spun completely around the dial twice, then stopped precisely on the 4. It was 4:20 a.m. The white skin flakes inside the room began to rise from the floor. They did not float like dust. They moved in straight, horizontal lines, drawn toward the 3-inch gap at the top of the door frame like steel shavings toward a magnet. As they passed through the light of the green lamp, they cast long, narrow shadows across my face that felt like thin needles of cold ice. The smell of old copper grease became thick enough to obstruct my breath. Every inhalation tasted like dry iron, like sucking on a rusted bolt in a freezing room. My lungs felt rigid, the tissue inside my chest clicking with a dry, papery sound every time the ribcage contracted. The radio speaker gave one final, heavy pop. "The loop is 40 minutes from closure," my own voice said from the funnel-shaped hole in the mesh. "The dispatcher has reached the lower gate. He is not walking on the gravel. He is walking on the air that rests above the gravel. Look at his boots, Mark. Look at the dry leather before you touch the brass." I kept my palms flat on my thighs. The split in the left armrest had reached the front bracket of the chair. The white plastic edges were pressing against the fabric of my sleeve, the sharp material cutting through the wool until I could feel the cold, sour fluid touching the skin of my forearm. The fluid was freezing. It did not bleed. It stayed on the skin like a circle of cold grease. Outside, the tall shape on the porch made its first movement. It did not knock. It did not rattle the latch. It raised its hand and pressed a single, flat object against the crimson window pane. It was a piece of yellow graph paper. It was covered in handwritten pencil text. The lines packed so tightly together, they looked like a solid block of gray graphite. The paper was pressed flat against the glass, held there by the dry weight of the fog behind it. I did not lean forward to read the text. My spine stayed pressed against the hard plastic back of the chair. But the green light from the desk lamp struck the paper from behind, projecting the mirrored image of the handwriting directly onto the green wall in front of me, right over the eye-shaped droplet of the paint blister. The handwriting was my own. It was written in the rapid, frantic cursive I use when the shift is late. The text read, "The boots are dry because the rain on the road does not have a weight. It is not water, Mark. It is the same material as the mist. If you open the door, the material will enter the 7-foot space. The green paint will turn red again. It will turn red like the first layer." The clock clicked once more. 4:32 a.m. The yellow paper against the crimson window pane did not slide down. It stayed fixed to the glass, the graphite lines beginning to smoke as the heat from the cracked lamp bulb struck the silver print from 3 feet away. The smoke from the yellow paper did not rise toward the ceiling tiles. It drifted horizontally, a thin, gray thread of carbon vapor that traveled from the window pane straight to the center of the room, wrapping itself around the suspended iron switch lever like a greasy wire. The smell of the smoke was cold. It tasted of old sulfur matches and dried river silt. The clock on the wall gave a flat, double click. 4:50 a.m. 10 minutes remained until the scheduled arrival of the morning dispatcher. According to the regional manuals, the morning light should be breaking over the eastern ridge of the mountain by now. But the sky through the double-paned window remained the same unmoving, slate gray. The fog did not lift. It grew thick, pressing its blue-gray mass against the glass until the timber frame of the window let out a long, wet groan. I sat motionless in the plastic chair. My ankles were numb, the cold having settled into the leather of my boots until my feet felt like 2 blocks of dry pine timber. The split in the left armrest had stopped expanding. The dark yellow foam inside was now covered in a thin layer of white frost, the sour zinc fluid having frozen into thousands of needle-like crystals that poked through the torn fabric of my sleeve. They did not cause pain. They caused a flat, dead neutrality in the skin of my forearm. At 4:55 a.m., the radio speaker gave a single massive hum that lasted 30 seconds. The transmission did not carry static. Carried the sound of a large room. An empty hall with concrete floors and high ceilings. In the background of the channel, I could hear the distinct sound of heavy iron cabinets being closed, one after another, in a long sequence. Slam, slam, slam. Then, a voice spoke. It was the voice of the Central Station dispatcher, a person I had never met, but whose code numbers were listed on the first page of the logbook. Station 42, the voice said. It was completely mechanical, devoid of breath or human cadence. The morning inspection vehicle has been canceled. The district office has classified the line as non-operational due to structural displacement. The operator currently sitting in the gray chair is advised to close the blue binder. Do not look at the final sheet. I did not close the binder. My hands did not leave my thighs. The green light from the desk lamp gave a sharp, dry pop. The vertical crack in the glass shade widened by 2 millimeters. A small piece of green glass breaking away from the rim and falling into the cold coffee mug below. It did not sink. It floated on top of the frozen skin film, its sharp edge reflecting a thin line of green light that pointed directly toward the door frame. Outside, the gravel path made a new sound. Thud. It was not the sound of a stone moving. It was the sound of a footstep that carried no weight. A heavy, blunt compression that happened precisely 3 feet from the bottom wooden step. The interval was exactly 60 seconds. 1 step for every minute that remained before 5 a.m. The thing walking did not have wet soles. The gravel did not squelch from mountain rain. The sound was dry, like a piece of salted leather striking a concrete floor inside an abandoned basement. I kept my eyes fixed on the eye-shaped droplet in the paint blister. In the reflection of the water bead, I could see the bottom of the wooden stairs. A pair of black leather boots had entered the frame. They were old. The leather was cracked along the toe box, showing gray fibers underneath the synthetic finish. But they were completely dry. There was no mud on the welt. There was no moisture from the blue mist on the laces. They looked like they had been stored inside a sealed zinc box for 40 years. The clock dropped its final tooth for the hour. Clang. The sound was loud, vibrating through the 7-foot room until the white card stock with my name on it slipped from the iron clipboard and fell to the floor face down. It was 5 a.m. The door handle did not turn. The heavy iron deadbolt at the top of the frame did not snap. But the 3-inch gap at the top of the warped door began to widen. The pine planks did not split. They dissolved. the wood turning into a fine, brown powder that poured down the frame like sand through an hourglass. Within 10 seconds, the top half of the door was completely gone, leaving an open, rectangular void into the dark porch outside. The gray mist did not drift into the 7-foot room through the opening. The air outside the cabin was no longer blue-gray. It was black, a flat, non-reflective black that had no depth. It looked like a solid wall of charcoal that had been built directly against the threshold of switch station 42. Standing in that open rectangle of blackness was the dispatcher. He did not have a face. In the place where the features should have been, there was only a flat sheet of gray parchment paper, held to the skull by 2 thin strips of black electrical tape that ran behind the ears. On the center of the parchment, a single line of text had been stamped in violet ink using an industrial rubber marker. Inspected by Operator 04. His Sarkari coat was dry. The brass buttons were tarnished, covered in a thin film of green oxidation that smelled of old pennies. He raised his right arm. His hand was covered in a heavy, brown cotton glove that had turned stiff with age and dried grease. Between his index finger and thumb he held a key. It was not the 6-inch brass key described in the regulations. It was a key made of blue plastic. It was the exact same material and color as the binder resting on my desk. The edges of the key were split, showing the gray cardboard core beneath the synthetic blue skin. The radio unit speaker gave 3 identical pops. "The shift is over, Mark," my own voice said from the funnel-shaped hole. "The morning dispatcher has delivered the authorization. You can stand up from the gray plastic chair now. The 5-foot wall is waiting behind you." I did not move my spine. My muscles stayed locked against the backrest. I looked down at the blue binder. The 5th page was gone. In its place was the inner cover of the back lining. The yellow adhesive had dried completely, causing the paper to lift away from the plastic skin. Underneath the sheet, on the raw gray cardboard of the binder's frame, a final rule had been written using a heavy black marker. The ink was fresh. It was still wet, its chemical odor mixing with the smell of the burnt yellow paper from the window. The dispatcher does not possess a blue key. If the blue key is presented at the threshold, the recovery of the operator is impossible. The 7-foot space has become a logical error. Do not accept the blue plastic. It is the material that replaces the skin. The dispatcher's gloved hand moved forward 1 inch, crossing the line where the top half of the door had been. As his fingers entered the 7-foot space of the room, the green paint on the eastern wall began to turn red. Not a bright red, the dark, coagulated color of the first layer of paint from 1974. The color spread across the pine planks like water through dry salt, swallowing the blisters, the peeling curls, and the eye-shaped droplet until the entire corner was dark and bloody. The clock did not click for 5:01 a.m. The black second hand on the dial began to slide backward, moving counterclockwise past the 12, past the 11, past the 10, its motion smooth, silent, and continuous. The black second hand did not stop its reverse motion. It continued to slide counterclockwise across the white dial face of the relay box, past the 9, past the 8. With every major mark the needle cleared, the light from the desk lamp grew narrower, the green line thinning until it was no more than a pencil stroke of colored light slicing through the graphite darkness of the cabin. The room was no longer 7 feet square. The movement of the walls was silent, but the space inside the baseboards had contracted until the gray plastic chair was pressed firmly against the back wall. The timber boards behind my spine were ice cold, the 3 layers of old paint freezing through the fabric of my flannel shirt until the skin between my shoulder blades felt stiff, like frozen lard. The dispatcher standing in the dissolved rectangle of the door did not drop his arm. His stiff, brown cotton glove remained extended into the room, holding the blue plastic key precisely 3 inches above the black iron switch lever. The blue synthetic skin of the key had begun to peel, revealing the same gray compressed cardboard structure that formed the core of the logbook on my desk. A voice came from the open threshold. It did not come from the parchment paper taped over the dispatcher's skull. It came from the dark, non-reflective blackness that stood behind his shoulders. It was the voice of Vance, but it was no longer using his adult tone. It was the voice of Vance when he was 9 years old, his pitch thin, hollow, and singing like a child reciting a nursery rhyme in an empty basement. The logbook has 64 pages. The voice sang from the dark. Every page is a year mark. Every year has a blue cover. If you don't take the key before the clock reaches the half hour, the entry for 1986 will be written in the dark, with a wet technical pen. I did not lift my arms. My palms stayed locked against the gray plastic of my trousers. I looked down at the floorboards near my right boot. The white cardstock that had fallen from the iron clipboard was resting face down on the pine wood. But the paper was no longer still. It was vibrating against the timber with a very fast, microscopic shudder that made the dry wood fibers around it hum. Slowly, the cardstock began to flip over. It did not lift into the air. The paper warped along the center axis, the cardboard structure twisting until the white side became visible under the narrow green needle of the lamplight. The name mark was gone. The black ink had migrated across the fibers, forming new characters that had been traced with the same thin, industrial marker. The new text was printed in narrow, tall serif letters with wide spacing. It read, Operator 04. Deployment date, October 14th, 1986. The typewriter sound on the radio unit gave one final, heavy explosion. Clack. The gray paper speaker cone tore along its outer circumference, a jagged, horizontal split opening through the mesh that smelled immediately of dry ozone and burnt copper wire. The red indicator light on the face of the box flared into a blinding, violet glare that lasted for 2 seconds, then died completely. The silence that followed was total. It was the absolute zero of the mountain. The low, mechanical vibration of the granite generator was completely gone. The sound of the wind was gone. The only thing that remained was the internal mechanism of my own body, the dry, papery clicking of my lung tissue every time my chest collapsed under the weight of the air. At 4:30 a.m., according to the reverse alignment of the clock, the dispatcher's gloved hand began to dissolve. The brown cotton material did not drop the blue key. It turned into a fine, gray soot that fell onto the suspended iron lever in a silent cascade. The blue plastic key did not fall. It stayed fixed in the empty air, floating precisely where his fingers had been, its split edges glowing with a faint, bioluminescent violet that matched the dead light of the radio dial. The parchment paper on the dispatcher's face began to peel away from the black electrical tape. As the adhesive failed, the sheet slid downward, falling through the open frame of the door onto the gravel path below. In the reflection of the eye-shaped paint droplet on the red wall, I could see what lay beneath the paper. There was no bone. There was no skull. There was only a second sheet of typewriter paper, glued directly to the muscle tissue with thick, yellow cement. On the center of the sheet, 3 words had been typed in all capital letters. The line is clear. The shape of the dispatcher then stepped backward. He did not turn his body. He moved horizontally into the flat, charcoal wall of the exterior darkness, his dark Sarkari coat being swallowed by the non-reflective blackness millimeter by millimeter until only the brass buttons remained visible. Then the buttons faded out like old grease dissolving in acid. I looked at the blue binder on the desk. The back cover had curled upward from the dampness, the raw gray cardboard underneath now entirely visible. The wet black marker text had dried, its surface turning into a dull, charcoal powder that looked 50 years old. Beneath the final rule, a new paragraph had appeared. It was written in my own handwriting, but the cursive was tight, neat, and perfectly level. The shift at switch station 42 does not end with an individual. It ends with a modification of the nameplate. If you look at the white clipboard by the door, you will understand that the room has always been 5 feet wide. The other 2 feet were occupied by the person who sat here before 1986. Do not look behind the plastic chair. The flannel is still wet. I did not turn my head. I kept my eyes fixed on the red corner in front of me. The dark, coagulated color of the first paint layer was now dry. It had lost its gloss, turning into a flat, institutional gray that looked exactly like the corrugated tin plates on the exterior of the cabin. The eye-shaped droplet in the center of the blister had dried up, leaving nothing but a small, circular ring of salt on the timber that looked like a blind socket. The clock gave a final, dull metallic ping. The internal brass wheel had completed its reverse rotation. The black second hand snapped back onto the 12, its motion stopping with an absolute, rigid finality that froze the mechanism for the second time. The green lamp on the desk did not turn off. The light simply lost its color. The needle-like beam became a flat, dead white that illuminated nothing but the blue plastic binder and the broken ceramic mug. The frozen skin film on top of the black coffee had turned into a solid block of gray ice, its surface completely clear, showing the small fragment of green glass trapped inside the center like a dead fly in amber. Outside the cabin, the sound of the gravel path restarted. Crunch. It was the sound of a single stone shifting against another stone. It happened at 5:50 p.m. The thing walking on the path was moving away from the cabin, its steps unhurried, rhythmic, and heavy. It was the sound of Vance's old boots, their leather dry and cracked, pressing into the wet mountain earth as he walked down the incline toward his truck. The shift was beginning again. The blue plastic key remained suspended in the center of the 7-foot room, its violet glow throwing the long, narrow shadow of the manual iron lever across the gray plastic backrest of my chair. The shadow reached my shoulders, climbing up the flannel of my sleeve until it touched the skin of my throat. The air in the room grew very quiet. It carried the smell of cold grease, old rain, and wet pine boards that had been left to rot inside a dark drawer since the winter of 1982. The logbook on the desk was open. The first page was blank. The typewriter text was gone. The yellow adhesive had turned to dust. There was only the blue plastic cover, its split corners showing the gray cardboard structure underneath, waiting for the technical pen to trace the first capital letter of the next report.